The government took early steps to impose a stringent lockdown when the figures were still relatively small. However, they have continued to rise through the lockdown across the country, and there are only a very few states that have managed to flatten the curve, Kerala being the most notable amongst them. The Prime Minister took steps to formulate a regional multilateral response to the pandemic. He held a virtual meeting with most of the SAARC countries, excluding, unfortunately, Pakistan, which chose not to attend, and set up a fund for dealing with the pandemic. The steps that the government of India have taken can be described as a middle-class response. The immediate announcement and implementation of the lockdown meant that states had little time to prepare for the crisis that would hit migrant workers and the poor, who were left stranded without housing, without food, and without money to make their ways home. That was a terrible blot, I might say, on our country. And we see that the steps that have been taken now that the crisis unfolded have also been rather small in comparison to what they should have been. In other words, some bare necessities in terms of food began to be provided. Some shelter was provided both by state governments and NGOs. But beyond that, very little else has been done. Now arrangements are being made for migrants to return home. We can also say that the response to this pandemic reveals that already existing fault lines in our country have been exacerbated. Again, most noticeable here is the attacks that have been made on Muslims. Many have even been accused of trying to spread the pandemic rather than to take required steps in terms of self-isolation. Unfortunately, we have seen a growing trend of communalization in our country, and much is going to depend on what steps the government of India takes. What does all this mean in terms of forecasting for India? If the global economy contracts and countries start to focus more on regional than on global trade, the consequences for India will be severe. Our trade is globally oriented, as is the trade of almost all the South Asian countries. Of course, if we were to retool to focus more on regional trade in South Asia, that would be a net good. It would open new windows for peacemaking between the countries of South Asia, many of which have long-standing conflicts between them. Socially, the pandemic has exacerbated already existing fault lines. We have seen a growing trend of illiberalism in our country, and that unfortunately is set to continue. Especially the polarization between minorities and majority populations, attacks on human rights, the media, and the weakening of institutions that are supposed to act as a check on the executive. Politically, too, the forecasts are fairly grim. The relationship between the center and the states has weakened considerably. There's a great deal of tension during this period, too, where states accuse the center of discriminating against those opposition rule states in terms of both economic and medical aid during this pandemic. That, unfortunately, too, is a trend that is going to be set to continue. Nevertheless, there is one piece of good news, which is the environmental impact that the lockdown has had on our polluted cities has been to improve the air quality immeasurably. Now, there are lessons to be learned from that for both industry and for government, and if those lessons are learned, then we can at least hope for better on that front.